Hi, my name is Aidan. In this screencast, we will extend our ASP.NET NG2 seed project to consume data from an API controller in ASP.NET 5. If we switch to the browser, we have a very simple seed project going for us. We are binding a text and we are binding and listening for events from an input field. We can update the UI. So now we want to add an API controller to our ASP.NET project and fetch data from there instead. So we're going to start by adding MVC, control period, and now we've added MVC to the container, and we're also going to want to tell it that we want to use the OWIN middleware. And I noticed that we got the RC2 version. We actually want the release candidate 1 version to be consistent. So let's add our first controller. We're gonna create a folder called controllers. We're gonna add a new item. It's gonna be a server-side class. I'm gonna name it data controller. And what we need to do here is just inherit the base class controller. And we're going to configure a root for this controller by using attribute routing and tell it that the root to this controller will be API and then whatever the controller name is. Let's define the get method. It'll return a class named shipments or shipment. We'll create in a second. So let's add a new folder that will contain our domain models and add a class called shipment. And our shipment class will have an ID property, a string telling it from where we're shipping it, and another string property it's gonna define where its destination is, and a date time that's gonna tell us when we shipped it. Let's add the namespace. Now let's make up some data that we'll return here. And this should be everything we need to do. We can now test our API by using Postman. So if we try to retrieve data from the controller, we can see that we successfully fetched the data. And what we will do for future screencasts, we're going to add the authorize attribute to protect this API and require the user to sign in before we can fetch the data. And we're also just going to get the user data and not retrieve all shipments like we're doing now. But this is just in the beginning, so we'll refactor this later on. So now that we have our server-side model, let's model this on the client as well. So we're going to create a corresponding TypeScript file that will contain all our models. I'm going to export a class called shipment, and it will have the same properties. We're going to have a public ID, which will be a number. Let's format this a bit nicer. An origin, which will be a string. A destination, and a ship date that will be of the type any, and we're gonna see why in a bit. So we switch back to our app.ts file. We're gonna import our models. We're gonna import from model. I actually wanted to name it models, but I see that I typed model instead, and we're gonna import shipment. Right, so we're gonna do it like that. So we're also going to need to get the HTTP library for Angular. And let's just get that as well. It's going to be named HTTP dev.js for build. We can see that we've copied HTTP dev. Let's include that in there as well. And I'm also going to move out the template. I'm not fond of defining the view syntax in line like this. So we're going to have a template URL, and we can actually get rid of that and recreate it from scratch. And it's going to reside inside app.html. So we're going to need to add an app.html file. Right, so for some reason Visual Studio thinks that I want to group these. That actually makes me want to move it into a separate folder. Let's call it partials. And get rid of the JS file. Alright, so now we're going to want to import a couple of classes from Angular 2 HTTP. We're going to get HTTP providers. We're going to pass in the providers down to the bootstrap method. So I've already done this once in a previous screencast. Only then it was called HTTP bindings, which they've changed the name to providers instead. Alright, so now that we've done that, we can go ahead and create a constructor and resolve an HTTP service. And let's create a method, get data, that will fetch data for us. We're also not going to have the message hello world anymore. We'll display shipments instead, which will be an array of shipment. And we can initialize it to an empty array. So let's create our view template first, since we know that we want to iterate over a shipment and we already know how what a shipment looks like. And since we're gonna iterate over something, we're gonna need to import the ng4 directive and pass it in as a directive to the view annotation. So now we can come here to app.html and create a div that will for loop over shipments. We're going to define the variable shipment, and let's output the properties. We have the origin and the destination. So now all that is left is to retrieve the data from the API and map it to our shipments variable. And we're going to do one more thing on the server side before we actually do that. If we switch back to Postman, we can see that when we follow best practices on the server side, we're going to name our properties with an uppercase first letter of each property. But if we follow best practices on the client side in the JavaScript world, we're going to want to name them with lowercase letters. So when we serialize the data and deserialize it when posting back and forth between the server and the client, we're going to want to transform this on the fly without actually needing to map these two conventions. And we're going to do that by simply add JSON options, which will take a lambda. Let's format this a bit nicer. And we can set the serializer settings, contract resolver, to new camel case property names contract resolver. And this resides within Newtonsoft JSON serialization. Let's get rid of this comment so we have more space. If we switch back to Postman now and retrieve the data again. Yeah, first of all, we got unauthorized. That's because I added the authorized attribute, but we're not going to do that for this screencast. If we refetch it now again, we can see that we have the expected convention that we want on the client side. So let's retrieve the data. We're going to call HTTP get, pass in the path to where we want to fetch data from. Then we're going to map the result to JSON. And we're going to map that JSON object. Now it looks like we don't have enough context information about the result here. So let's just quickly solve this by casting this to a response. We're going to need to import a response up here. Right, so now we can cast it. And now we're going to want to iterate over the shipments we retrieve from the server, which will be array of any. And we're going to want to define a result. And this result will be a type result of shipment. And now if we actually got a result that we can iterate over, let's for each over it and push it onto our result array. And we're going to push a new shipment and pass in the arguments. And that will be ID, shipment origin, shipment destination, shipment ship date. And we're actually going to want to create a data object of this ISO standardized text string that we retrieve from the API. So we're going to do new date and pass in that string. And now that we've tried to map the result, we can subscribe for the result. And on our success method, we can just assign the shipments property to the data. Let's also log it to the console to see what we get, just in case something goes wrong. And let's also pass an error lambda and log the error to the console as well if something goes wrong. Right, and now obviously we can't assign void since we need to return the result up here. And this should go away and get rid of that and finish the subscribe method. Format this a bit nicer. All right, you can probably zoom out a bit. Hopefully it will fit on screen. And now let's try this code out. Switch back to our browser, refresh. And we're loading and something didn't go well. And we've just specified the path wrong. So let's fix that. We moved it to partials since we didn't like that Visual Studio paired the JS file with the HTML file just because it had the same name. Yeah, and before we actually can run, we obviously need to call the getData function as well. So we're gonna do this getData, or else nothing will happen. Switch to the browser, refresh, and we actually got the data. And we probably want to format the data a bit nicer. We can use pipes for that. And let's format this as a date, year, month, day, and then hours and minutes. Refresh, and it looks a bit nicer. So now we've successfully consumed data from our API controller, both from Angular, and we've also checked it from Postman. And in the next screencast, we're gonna get this data from a database instead of storing it in memory like we're doing now in the controller. And then we'll probably do another screencast where we switch on the authorize attribute and implement cookie-based authentication. So hope you guys learned something, and until next time, have a nice day.